welcome to New York City Atheists, live on tape, brought to you by New York City Atheists Incorporated. I'm your host, Dennis Horvitz, the David Letterman of the Hopelessly Damned. The topic of this week's show is Hobbits, a new human species. Actually, it's posed as a question. Why does a surprise skeletal discovery add exciting new information to our knowledge of human evolution, and why are some religionists upset about it? Let me just read from our press release, skillfully put together by Jane Everard. Nicknamed Hobbits, these little people were discovered on the island of Flores in Indonesia, and they're little people who averaged a little over 3 feet tall, and they disappeared about 17,000 years ago. I think it was right around my high school graduation. Maybe they were in the class just behind me. Okay. But they left behind nearly intact skeletons and artifacts. Evolutionary scientists believe the hobbits to be a newly discovered species called the hominid Homo floresiensis, and it's an up to now unknown branch of the human evolutionary tree. And to explain this will be Dr. William L. Junger, is that how you pronounce it correctly? Who is the chairman of the Anatomical Sciences Department in the Medical School of Stony Brook University, as well as a distinguished teaching professor. His expertise is in, for which he is internationally known, is in functional anatomy. Now, this, as he will go on to say, this discovery is extremely controversial. And Desmond Morris, the author of the book The Naked Ape, has remarked that these hobbits are going to be the death of religion, causing creationists to be up in arms. Of course, I don't know if I would agree that it's the death of religion. That has been predicted before, but it certainly doesn't add to their argument, let's put it that way. So before I manage to mess up this information any longer, please welcome Dr. Junger.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always nice to have a public forum to discuss one's personal obsessions. Today's no different. What I'm going to be talking about today, can you hear me in the back all right? Do you need all right. What I want to talk to you today about is sort of the latest addition to the human evolutionary tree. This is Homo floresiensis. It's an addition, it's a new twig, and it's even though it's small, it's really shaken the tree a great deal, and I'll go into some detail about that. The fossil I'm talking about here is the skull, and actually I have a show and tell for you. This is the skull, a prototype made from a CT scan. The fossils themselves are too fragile to be molded and cast in traditional ways, so this is created digitally. So I'm just going to check your pockets on the way out today. Make sure pass that around to you. The fossils that I'm talking about actually come from an island in the Indonesian archipelago. It's called Flores, and just to show you the sort of cosmic connection between that and Long Island. Actually, this is about twice as long. This is about 260 miles long, incredibly rough and complex topology. And the place we're going to go to is a place called near Rutang. It's a cave site called Liang Bua, which means cool cave. What I'm going to suggest, and I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that in many ways these fossils represent the black swan of paleoanthropology. By that I mean these are fossils that never would have been anticipated, and their discovery has changed the way we think about many aspects of human evolution. When you have something of that magnitude, it's not surprising that it's considered heretical by a variety of people. Now, it will not shock you to learn that some of the religious folks find this to be particularly heretical, but I'm also going to suggest that there are scientists in this business who are struggling just as much as the creationists are to make sense of this and to incorporate it into their understanding of human evolution. And that's what I meant by the Hobbit heresies. I just want to remind you that no one does this kind of research by themselves. Paleoanthropology is very much a team discipline. It requires geologists, archaeologists, people like myself who study the bones, And I just want to give credit to the fact that we have a very international, this is not colonial paleoanthropology anymore. We involve our Indonesian colleagues in every step. This is the director of the Institute, Tony Jubiantono. This is the person who put it all together, Mike Morwood, Thomas Utikna, and my colleague at Stony Brook, Susan Larson. Here we are. I don't know if any of you saw this, but we had a symposium about the Hobbits at Stony Brook in April. Nice turnout, where we were able to just put on display for the very first time prototypes like the skull you've seen being passed around. The latest addition is a young fellow, Matt Tocheri, who's brought laser scanning and digital technology to our arsenal. So, again, put it in broader context. There's the island of Flores, down the Indonesian archipelago. The site that we're going to talk about, we have dug from about 14,000 to 95,000 years deep into these cave sediments. And these are radiocarbon dated, thermoluminescence dated. We have very good stratigraphic control for a cave site. The first papers that came out of this were published in Nature. The first one was by Peter Brown et al., and then followed up by Mike Morwood. Here is the first cover, 2004. And I kid you not, I had to check the date on this to make sure it wasn't April 1st, because I had such a difficult time believing that this was real. This is sort of an understatement. Short for her age, they're incredibly tiny, as was alluded. That's where the Hobbit nickname came from. And it was suggested that we had a new member of our genus Homo. Whenever you see the word Homo, that usually translates colloquially into sort of human. So suddenly we had a third species of Homo in Southeast Asia. That created a little consternation among some of my colleagues. Here is the cave in a panoramic view. This is an enormous cave. The road runs down here. You have to come around and into it. This is called Cool Cave, and it was discovered by a Jesuit priest from the Netherlands in the 1960s, because he wandered around and saw that there was a school class being given in this area. It was the only place in the area that it was cool and there was light, so you could have a classroom throughout that period. And he dug a little bit and found some skeletons, very modern in aspect, modern people, shipped them back to the Netherlands, and that was pretty much it until these guys came in and decided to dig deep in the same cave. And what they did was incredible. All right, here's the inside of that cave again. Now you're looking out through the opening. It's enormous, and we've only touched a fraction of this cave. And so what was unique about this expedition was they put an elevator shaft in, basically. They went down over 10 meters. And in order to do that, they had to go to grave digging school in order to figure out how to protect yourselves, how to keep this from collapsing in on you as you move deeper and deeper. About 6 meters, roughly 20 feet down, they found this. This is in situ. This is one of the most complete fossil humans ever discovered anywhere in the world. We call it LB1, Liang Bua 1. And here's what it looks like once you lay it out. What's remarkable about this is I'm so used to dealing with fragments, little bits of jaw, a little bit of the hip bone or something. Here we have a complete skull and jaw that's going around. We have upper limb, lower limb. We have most of the skeleton. And it gives us opportunities to ask questions we never would have imagined before. And I'm not sure everyone in this room is as fascinated by details of anatomy as I am. So I'm not going to go into great detail. So I just want to let you know that there are interesting things about every part of this skeleton. This is not a little person. Now, I'll talk about the skull in a second. But it's got a shoulder that's very, very primitive. It's got a hip that's very flaring and Australopithecus-like. And I'll talk about Australopithecus in a second. It has very, very short hind limbs compared to its upper limbs. It has a body plan that if this skeleton were found in Ethiopia 3 million years ago, people would just shrug and say, okay, it's another Australopithecine. But the fact that this is found 17,000 years ago in a remote island of Indonesia is what's got people sort of trying to make sense of it. It's captured the fascination of everyone. Literally, the artists have been having a field day trying to make sense of this, trying to see what did it look like? How close was it to modern people in its appearance? Because it's Homo floresiensis, or because the type specimen is a female, she's been nicknamed Flo, for better or worse. There's a small problem with this reconstruction, but these are a little more accurate, perhaps. And what you can see is the imagination of the artists have taken over, from sort of angry to quizzical to God knows what. My favorite is this one. This is, you got to wonder what those crazy Dutchmen are smoking sometimes. Because this is the only reconstruction of it as a quadruped on all fours. This clearly is like humans in the sense that it walked on its hind limbs, and we've seen other features that make it very human-like, despite its small body size and other peculiarities. Now, I guess it's made the big time. It's been on the Science Time pages here and again. But this is the first time I was coming home from giving a lecture at the University of Chicago in early last month, and I picked up the Saturday paper, and I found on the editorial, on the op-ed page, an editorial about hobbits. And I wasn't quite sure to make of it, but I was sort of pleased, because it says we're not sure exactly what to make of Homo floresiensis, and that's kind of a shared consensus by many people. And it goes on to say they were small, and they've been nicknamed hobbits. And then the fact that they are very recent has got people puzzled. But I like this last part. If these hominids are indeed a separate species, they remind us that life is a problem for which the solutions are many. Not surprisingly, look carefully for those forks in the evolutionary path that lead most directly to us. And we always overvalue our own success. We know very little about the lives of many of the hominid species, and by hominid, just extinct relatives of us, that preceded us. But the fact is that they flourished for a time and left records of themselves, even if only in bone and stone, and that's success itself. So maybe we're penetrating the public's mind a little bit here. Let me just back up for 1 second and put this fossil in context. When I first started studying human evolution millennium ago, it seems like now, things seemed so simple. We had this sort of unilineal, connected dots approach to human evolution. We believed that there was some ape in Asia or Europe, maybe Africa, we weren't sure, that gave rise to Australopithecus, this ape man known from South Africa. We thought, yeah, maybe there was another form in Africa, a robust Australopithecine, sometimes called Paranthropus. This is Zinjanthropus. And then Australopithecus evolved into Homo erectus, which is the first cosmopolitan species, the first species that got outside of Africa. And this fossil is also from Indonesia, in Java, just up the chain. And then maybe there was this thing, Homo habilis, handyman. We weren't quite sure. It was all new and controversial. And that evolved into archaic Homo sapiens like Cro-Magnon, Neanderthals. We were arguing about them. We're still arguing about Neanderthals. And that evolved into modern Homo sapiens. It seemed consistent with the evidence we had at hand, and it was so simple and elegant. It turns out it was also horribly wrong. And it was wrong, and it's largely because it was not just ignorance. We didn't have a fossil record to really assess the complexity of human evolution, but it was also arrogance. To think that a few fossil localities in a few places in the world could reveal the entire complexity of human evolution. Now, I know this is where you all go to get your latest information on science, Newsweek 2007. But I think this serves a purpose. It gives you the sense that there is a diversity of species in human evolution. Most of them, until 2 million years ago, occur in Africa and are dated as far back as 6 and 7 billion years ago. So in a sense, it's telling us that humans are like other mammals. We have a lot of evolutionary twigs, most of which go extinct. And we're the Lone Ranger. We're the last surviving member of this evolutionary twig. Now, where does Homo floresiensis fit in this big picture? Well, here it is, recent, and people have suggested it's a dwarfed, that somehow it's related to Homo erectus, which we know is in Indonesia, and this is just a dwarf of that. Other people have suggested that it's so primitive that it may be derived from something in Africa that snuck out of Africa earlier than we expected. And there are things about it. I imagine most of you have heard of Lucy, the Ethiopian fossil. It's now on tour, unfortunately, around the country. And in many respects, the skeleton of this fossil looks a lot like Lucy. So it's just incredibly primitive. So this is Lucy over here, and what I'm going to tell you is that Floresiensis, even though it's 17,000 years ago, looks a heck of a lot like this. And it doesn't look very much like this. This is Homo erectus. This, again, is that first species that we put in our own genus that we call a human, and it already has limb proportions like you and me. Really long hind limbs is the hallmark of this species. So this is a fossil. Homo floresiensis is a fossil that's out of time, out of space, and just doesn't conform to what our expectations should be for something that is lingering in the corner of Southeast Asia until the day before yesterday, literally in geological terms. Now, I promise not to put you to sleep with the detailed anatomy of the wrist bones, as fascinating as I find them. But in 2007, we published a paper in Science that analyzed the wrist bones of the Hobbit in comparison to chimps, humans, and a lot of fossils. And to our surprise, and I think your eye can sort of tell you these color-coded are just little articular facets, we were shocked. This thing has a wrist, has a hand that is like an Australopithecine, not like a human. It has a hand that's in some ways more like a chimpanzee than a person. Yet, look over here. It had a wonderful tool kit. It had a core and flake technology. I mean, and it's maybe those don't look beautiful to you, but trust me, they work just great. They were defleshing. Mostly their favorite choice were sort of juvenile baby stegodon, these little pygmy elephant-like babies were their primary food. But these tools could be lost in Olduvai Gorge 2 million years ago, 2.5 million years ago. So this is sort of the first bit of cognitive dissonance in my field. Here we have a chimpanzee-sized brain with a primitive wrist making tools. Everyone thought that we needed a big brain and modern hands. And that's one of the things that made us human. Clearly, there's more than one way to be human, and I think this illustrates that nicely. Now, again, this is the only other part of the anatomy I promised to inflict upon you, but it's amazing. We never have complete feet in the fossil record before. So I've sort of developed a kind of a scientific foot fetish in the last 30 years. And I've immersed myself in collections of all kinds. And we've put the foot of the Hobbit together. And it's quite a foot. It lacks the arch that we think of as a modern human. The arch that we have is a wonderful mechanism for shock absorption and recovery of elastic energy. This is a foot like Lucy. It's flat-footed. It has long, very long and curved toes. This is not a runner's foot. This is fine for walking, but this is not a runner's foot. And it's got a short, stubby, big toe. It's fully in line, like yours and mine, but it's just a stubby little guy. Again, this is a mosaic of primitive and derived features we've never seen in the fossil record before. And what's amazing, here is the shin bone or tibia, and here's the thigh bone or femur that goes with it. The foot is almost as long as the shin. Now, look down your foot and try to imagine what it would be like to walk, let alone find shoes and a bag to match, to have a foot like that. It's unbelievable. And in fact, if you do a simple ratio of the foot to this thigh bone, the femur length, these are people of normal body size. These are pygmy humans. No difference. Little size doesn't, you don't grow a big foot if you're little. Here is the Hobbit. And what does it look like? It looks like a pygmy chimpanzee from Africa in terms of its pedal proportions. And this is all driven by this incredibly short hind leg. The foot is long only in comparison to the hind leg. Now what does this mean? What does this funny foot mean? Well, in collaboration with some folks at NOVA, we think that it made it, how do I put this scientifically? They walked funny. And so this is our first attempt to sort of show you. Foot clearance is the hard part. If you've got a long foot, imagine walking in oversized shoes. You've got to clear that toe every time you move. One more time. So again, it's human-like in terms of its gait in many respects, but you've got to get that foot. Your toe just barely grazes the surface every time you walk. And that's how at least that's our first approximation. All right, now, you can imagine, when you have fossils of this type, you've got to defend it. And skepticism is important. It's an important part of this business. You know, you've got to sort of put on your armor and deal with it, because people are going to come after you. It's challenging so many notions. And I think what's happened is that as we continue to publish articles, I think what's going on now, we published in Nature last month about the foot, and that's gotten a lot of people off the fence, and I think on our side of the argument. I think it's boiled down to this, that again, it comes back that this is a new species of our genus with a mosaic of primitive and derived features. By that I mean features like us, but many that are very different than us. And the two explanations, two competing arguments, are still being worked out. One is that it's a dwarfed erectus. I don't think that's likely now, given the fact that we have other dwarf humans that don't converge on primitive conditions. Or it implies an earlier out-of-Africa dispersal than we ever imagined. And that's sort of that's where I'm putting my money for now. And we have digs going on in other parts of Flores that we hope will help resolve that. However, there is a very vocal minority who cannot come to grips with this possibility, and have argued instead that it is in fact a modern human, since we have it to 17,000 years ago, and they combed the literature looking for clinical syndromes that result in small body size, as if this is all about small body size. Now the ones that have come up, there's a condition known as Laron syndrome. I'll show you about that in a second. This is basically a pituitary dwarf-like individual that are now treated, once they're identified, large populations in Israel and Ecuador. It also suggests that there's a primary dwarfism whose genetic basis has been worked out. This is an osteodysplastic primordial dwarf. And one I'm not even going to bother with, this notion that they were somehow hypothyroid cretins, is probably the most preposterous. But they have gone through and looked to try to find syndromes that could perhaps explain away these fossils as mere pathologies. That way, it's easier to dismiss than to assimilate the implications for many of my colleagues. Now, first of all, this whole issue of microcephaly. Yes, the brain is small, but it's possible to use modern human brains and to develop mathematical functions that classify new specimens. LB1 is classified 100% of the time with modern human brains. It's not identical, but it's more similar to these than it is to these are microcephalic brains. These ones in red are microcephalics that were not included in the analysis, but were used as test cases to see if it worked. They're classified correctly. So there's 100% correct classification. Despite its small size, it looks more like a human. And by the way, Homo erectus does microcephalics. I think that's the end of the story for microcephaly. The other syndromes, people just aren't paying attention. I guess that's what irks me. This is a paper published in Science last year by Rausch and 1,000 others. They've gotten into the genetic basis of this kind of primordial dwarfism. These are usually you see them in children. A lot of these individuals don't have a very long life, but they have an enormous number of problems. They have relatively small hands and feet. That's clearly not like a hobbit. But you just go through the list of things that are part of the differential diagnosis for this syndrome. And these individuals don't look anything like Homo floresiensis except they're short. And the kicker is there's been no documented pregnancy in these individuals. So how you can have 75,000 years of fossils without procreation is kind of hard to explain. So I think we can dismiss that. And what bothers me more than anything really is there was a paper published 2 years before this one that discussed why this syndrome doesn't work. It was completely ignored in this paper in Science. It's shoddy scholarship, gang. Almost over. I'll be happy to take any questions you might have. Finally, this is the Laurent syndrome. And yes, the individuals are short in stature. But these are the part of the Ecuadorian population. And they're in the news lately because for some reason there have been, they don't seem to ever get cancer. So people are trying to figure out what is it that's part of this syndrome that gives them, if not immunity, a much reduced risk of developing any kinds of cancer. But a paper was published, and we recently published a rebuttal showing that of the 31 features they claim to be similar between Laurent syndrome and Forzythia, it's just all smoke and mirrors. It's just not true. Again, it's this urge, this need to dismiss rather than to make sense. So, to sum up, there is no known pathological condition that matches the full phenotype. Now, and that's what it requires. You've got to come up with a syndrome, give me the differential diagnosis so I can test it. To say something is pathological, that's not a testable hypothesis. That's not science. And there's also no known pathology that pretty much recapitulates evolution. There's no pathology that turns you into an ancestral form. Nobody goes to the orthopedist complaining of chimpanzee wrist. It just doesn't happen. All right? So, use some common sense when it comes to some of this. And I think that Henry G. in Nature summed it up nicely. Such reaction is common in the wake of new hominid discoveries, which are routinely dismissed either as pathological humans or as apes. Such reactions say less about the facts than the mindsets of commentators who might be unwilling to have their comfortable views of the world so forcibly changed. Now, this is where I usually ask for an amen, but that may be the wrong time. So,